You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Tracy Borman, a name you probably recognize, not only because she is a phenomenal author, historian, broadcaster, and joint chief curator at historic royal palaces in Great Britain, but also because she joined us in July of 2022 to discuss her book, Crowne and Scepter, A New History of the British Monarchy. Today, we are discussing her latest effort, which is eminently readable, will make you smile, and when it comes to Henry VIII, maybe cringe once or twice. The book is titled Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who forever changed British history. Dr. Borman earned her PhD at the University of Hull. She has particular expertise in the 16th century, which is what we'll discuss today, but has also researched and written about the 11th, 17th, and 18th centuries. I love 18th century Britain. I love 18th century history. If I was just smart enough to understand the Enlightenment, I would read about it more. Dr. Borman specializes in Tudor monarchs and their courts, courtiers, the private lives of monarchs, and the history of witchcraft. She even got married at the Tower of London, which is a slightly different experience from the women we are going to discuss on today's podcast. Dr. Borman, thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for having me back.
Well, your books are so fun to read. I mean, just simply put, a lot of people don't read history because they think it's boring or it's a bunch of dates or any of that sort of stuff. But I wish more people tackled books like yours and they would realize that there's a whole nother side of history out there that's a bit bawdy. It's fun, it's naughty, it's courageous, and it's unpredictable. And that's some of the things that came out to me in reading your book. Is it the twists and the turns of this relationship, not only between Anne and Elizabeth, which Elizabeth died, Anne was executed when Elizabeth was very young, but her legacy lived on. But what is such a feature of British history is you're up one day and you're down the next.
Yeah, it so is. It's fortune's wheel. You can be at the top, as you say, and then very, very swiftly, in Anne Boleyn's case, and she wasn't the only one, to lose favor with Henry VIII, you're down and you're suddenly condemned for treason. And I personally believe, and I know I'm not alone in this, that Anne had done nothing wrong except not give Henry that son. And of course, she gets all the blame for that, nothing to do with Henry. And so, good old Thomas Cromwell, my old friend, makes up this case of adultery against her. And he makes sure of that case with 5 men, including incest with her brother George. So she stands no chance. But
how did your friend Thomas Cromwell turn out?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, he kind of lasted another 4 years, but then he found himself walking in Anne's footsteps and maybe even staying in the same apartment that she'd spent her final days. So you live by the sword and all that. Yeah.
Let's give some foundation here for the listeners here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Most people are familiar with the story of Henry VIII. He had 6 wives. He had a tumultuous private life. Is a towering figure in terms of Tudor government, British government, the war against the church, for lack of a better term, against the Catholic Church. So laying all of that aside, the subtitle of your book is The Mother and Daughter Who Forever Changed British History. So starting with Anne first, give us a little bit about her and how do you think she changed British history?
So Anne Boleyn was the daughter of a very ambitious, very successful courtier, Thomas Boleyn. So he was a great favorite with Henry VIII. Not exactly a self-made man, but, the Boleyns aren't the most noble family in England. But he recognizes potential in his daughter Anne. He sends her abroad for part of her education. And then she arrives in Henry VIII's court in 1522 when she's in her early 20s about. And she really stands out. She's got literally a je ne sais quoi after spending several years in France. And she's got this incredible charisma and self-confidence, so that even though she's not conventionally beautiful, she draws admirers and eventually attracts the attention of Henry VIII himself. Although it's not love at first sight. It takes him 4 years to notice Anne Boleyn, but then, goodness me, does he make up for lost time and starts besieging Anne with love letters, begging her to be his mistress. But famously, Anne holds out for a much greater prize, that of being Queen of England. And as you say, in the process, untold turbulence. Henry has to separate England from Roman Catholic Europe, create his own church, grant himself an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and all for Anne Boleyn. That's why I think she changed history. The Reformation may have eventually happened, but not in such a sudden, violent way. And so the religious landscape changed forever, the political landscape as well. She kind of blazed a trail for future Queen's consort, who could now play a political role. They're not just there to give birth, although, of course, ultimately she was there for that as well. And she changed history by giving birth to my favorite monarch of all time, Queen Elizabeth I. And what a trailblazer she was as well.
And the look on your face the first time you came on the podcast where I said some of your friends, Susanna Lipscomb, said she was overrated.
Oh,
we'll get to that in a bit.
Don't remind me. I
think your friends Owen Emerson and Kate McCaffrey may have said the same thing. We'll have to ask them.
Yeah, well, we'll see, because Owen and Kate, they usually get things right, but I might have to disagree with them on that.
And I may be not remembering it exactly right, but it was a fun discussion I had with them on the podcast, and they came on, I think, rightly because of the fact that you had come on, and we were all amazed at your knowledge and recall. We called you a computer.
Oh,
she is a computer of Tudor history, especially.
Well, thanks very much, Robert, for that, because I don't feel like a computer when I literally can't remember what I just went in a shop to buy or what I did yesterday. But when it comes to history, I guess my memory's a bit better.
Is it fair to say that the Boleyn family was prominent? You mentioned not noble necessarily, but prominent in England during this time, and Henry had friends there and apparently had a sexual relationship with Anne's sister. Am I remembering this correctly from your book? So he knew who they were. How does he go from sleeping with Anne's sister to courting Anne?
Yeah, I know. He's got a thing about the Boleyn women. And there was a rumor that he even had an affair with Anne's mother as well, just to complete the set, although Henry always denied that very strenuously. So, yeah, Mary Boleyn, I think we can infer she was the more attractive of the two Boleyn girls, certainly, physically, if not in her character, if that's not being too cruel to Mary. And yeah, she was the mistress of the King of France, Henry's great rival. So what's good enough for Francis I is good enough for Henry VIII. She then arrives at the English court and quickly becomes Henry VIII's mistress, and almost certainly bears him at least one child, Catherine Carey. So she becomes a favourite with Elizabeth I. And it's highly likely that she was the daughter of Henry VIII. She took the surname of Mary Boleyn's husband, William Carey. But then Henry tires of his mistresses very quickly. If they agree to be his mistress, then he just loses interest because it's all about the thrill of the chase for Henry. And Anne learns from that. She sees what's happened to her sister. And that's a big reason why she thinks, no, I think I'm going to hold out for something other than being a mistress. And in fact, I'm not even sure Anne was set on the crown from the beginning. I think she probably just wanted to marry somebody else, Thomas Percy, and she had obviously got some kind of relationship going, whether they were betrothed or not. So I don't think she really wanted Henry, shocking though that would have been to Henry himself. And of course, then it just made her all the more irresistible to this great hunter, Henry VIII.
And one of the reasons why she is able to resist him, either explicitly or implicitly, is because Henry happens to be married.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Henry VIII's first marriage, which was to Catherine of Aragon, who was married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. He died shortly after the wedding, as I recall. He didn't live very long. Yeah. And Henry married her. But they only had one child who lived to adulthood, and that was Mary, known to history as Bloody Mary, which us Catholics believe is just a slur. And the race, the need to produce a male heir. Talk to us a little bit first about his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but also the need, the drive, the obsession to produce a male heir.
So Catherine of Aragon was really an ideal wife in Henry's eyes in every respect but one. It becomes a familiar tale. She didn't give him a son. She had been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. You're quite right. And Arthur died young, and then Henry, in a very chivalrous fashion, kind of rescued this damsel in distress. She didn't have to return to Spain. He married her as one of the first things he did as king in 1509. And actually, they had a very happy marriage for almost 20 years. I'm often asked which of the six was Henry's favourite. And I would say probably Catherine of Aragon. She ticked all the boxes. As I say, the only problem was she couldn't give him a son. She had a short-lived son called Henry, but sadly, he died just a few weeks after his birth. And then, it's a tragic catalogue of stillbirths and miscarriages, and her only surviving child was the Princess Mary, later Queen Mary I. But so it all started to unravel really for Henry and for Catherine, and I can't overemphasize the importance of this male heir, because we might think now, well, so what? Henry had a daughter. Yeah, so why not be content with Mary? Well, we would think that today because thanks to the late Queen, Elizabeth II, women now have equal precedence with men in the royal succession. But the Tudors were still a quite new and fragile dynasty, really. And there were others waiting in the wings who believed they had a better claim to the throne. So Henry had to secure his dynasty with a son. Nothing else would do. Women weren't seen as being fit to rule. It wasn't illegal like it was in France, but still it was deeply frowned upon to have a woman on the throne. So Henry was desperate for a male heir. And this really drove pretty much all of his actions as his reign progressed.
And through his affairs, he produced at least one son that became
Yes.
prominent, Henry Fitzroy. So he then could say, the problem's not with me, it's with my queen. I can produce a son. Why can't she?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Henry Fitzroy was Henry VIII's pride and joy. He made him Duke of Richmond, and he made a big fuss of him. And that was for a reason. And as you say, it proved that, problem's not with me. I can have a son, must be my wife. And interesting, by the way, that Fitzroy ends up at the execution of Anne Boleyn. And I think that's deliberate. I think Henry VIII told him to go there just as a little visual reminder for Anne. I can have sons. It was all your fault.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is historian, author, and incredibly generous with her intellect, Dr. Tracy Borman. We are discussing Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. It's her new book, subtitled The Mother and Daughter Who Forever Changed British History. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, called it rewarding, beautifully envisioned, and full of insight. This is a must-read for Tudor history buffs. The Library Journal deemed it highly recommended for readers interested in British history, royalty, and the Tudor era. Are you gratified by such reviews, or do you realize that this sort of history just isn't for everyone?
Well, of course, I realize that this isn't for everyone. The Tudors, having said that, have this enduring appeal. But I can't tell you how much positive reviews mean to me. They're amazing, because you write this book and you spend months, sometimes years, researching, and it's quite a solitary thing. And you're writing and researching, thinking, is anybody actually going to read this and kind of get it and enjoy it? And then when you get a nice review, and there've been some lovely ones in the States, it means everything, and also not just from reviewers, but from just readers, and hopefully listeners to your podcast, and people who tweet me, and I absolutely love it, and I'm just endlessly grateful to those people. But no, absolutely, I'm not so blinded by the Tudors that I can't see that they're not everybody's cup of tea. In fact, history isn't, full stop. So, people have different interests. Of course they do. But all I can do is try and share my passion and what I've discovered, and just hope that it resonates with people. Because Anne Boleyn in particular is a very modern woman. I don't know if that's why she's the most popular of the six wives, but she's not a conventional 16th century woman who's prepared to be a second-class citizen. She's got opinions and she wants power. So that was something that came out in your book, and I don't remember exactly how you phrased it. So correct me here, but I think I'm going to get it right mostly. That the putting the physical qualities aside and the sexual desire and all that, but that the qualities in her personality that attracted Henry when he was pursuing her repelled him once he captured her. Quite right. Very neatly put. Yes, exactly. So he loved her feistiness, and that she argued with him, and that she was kind of high-handed and hard to get and all the rest of it. But then, as soon as they were married, he expected her to be like Catherine of Aragon was, and to be compliant and the typical passive Tudor wife. And of course, she wasn't. She carried on arguing with him. And now that lost all appeal because, they were sleeping together. Henry no longer had to pursue her. And that's when really the scales seemed to fall from his eyes. And he just thought, what have I done? What have I done? What have I married? But if she'd had that son, she would have been forever protected. There's no way Henry would have got rid of Anne Boleyn if she'd given him that healthy boy that he so desired.
And what exactly was Anne Boleyn doing when she caught Henry VIII's eye? For whom was she working?
Indeed, Catherine of Aragon. So it's all very tight knit, I think we can say, Yeah. So Anne's father had managed to secure his daughter Anne a position in Catherine's household. So talk about an uncomfortable arrangement. There's one scene described by a courtier of how the three of them are playing cards. Imagine the atmosphere, Henry and his kind of great love, Anne Boleyn, playing cards with Henry's wife, Catherine. And, you could have cut that atmosphere with a knife, I'm sure. And Anne is quite vicious, I have to say, towards Catherine. I think Catherine's actually quite dignified in this whole affair. But Anne, I think, born of insecurity, she's constantly trying to get what Catherine has. So down to kind of getting the best rooms at court, or, even removing Catherine's royal arms from the decoration of her rooms. So, she's not always admirable, is Anne, even though, I've got huge admiration for her as a whole. She can be quite vicious.
You mentioned earlier about sharing your passion, and obviously you didn't say this, so I'm going to say this, your brilliance. It's so entertaining. Oh, you're very welcome. It's so entertaining, not only to get a chance to talk to you, that's a real treasure, but to read your books. One of the things is, now that I've done so many of these podcast interviews with historians of all sorts of history, and as someone who wrote a master's thesis, right, that's like 100 pages, and I thought it was the end of the world. The thing that really strikes me is the amount of research that goes into these books. It's just, you just wonder what in the hell this person did, in your case, you did, for a year or 2 years or 3 years, other than sitting in some dingy record hall, looking up birth certificates and divorce records and all that stuff. Talk to the audience, please, about what goes into a book like this. And as an acknowledged expert in the time period, did you learn anything new through your research for this book?
Absolutely. Well, I have to say that for me, the research is the most fun part of the whole process. I absolutely love delving around in archives. And what I do when I'm writing a book is I kind of start out by reading a couple of the sort of modern works, so secondary sources, as they're called, about history books about the subject, just to get a general steer. But then straight away I go to the original archival sources. And where possible, I actually look at the original documents rather than a digital version or a transcription, because you find out so much more. The Victorians were great at cataloguing, transcribing Tudor documents, but they missed out a lot in the process. They missed out things that they thought were irrelevant, but it's those details that I honed in on, the kind of domestic, the personal. And yes, I absolutely found things out that really surprised me. I mean, when I started this process, I have to be honest, I was thinking, is there going to be enough for a book here? Elizabeth is less than 3 years old when Anne is executed. How much can we possibly know about their relationship? And then I ended up with an embarrassment of riches. And as ever, some of the most intriguing documents were the ones that sound the driest. So account books, inventories. They told me what Anne was spending her money on, mostly her daughter, but also the possessions of Anne that Elizabeth chose to keep. Because when Anne was executed, all of her goods, her worldly goods, went to the king, and they remained in his possession, those that he didn't destroy. And then when he died, all of his possessions were kind of divided up between his children. And of course, Edward, as the boy, got first choice, then Mary, then Elizabeth. And Elizabeth did not go for any high value items. She went for items associated with her late mother, Anne. And it's such a telling way of how she honored her mother, how loyal she felt to Anne, even though she could have had hardly any memories of her. So yeah, you learn a lot from those kind of fairly dry sounding documents. And it's a joy for me to go through them all.
When are Henry and Anne married?
They get married in January 1533. They may have actually gone through a form of betrothal earlier than that, They sail over to France towards the end of the previous year to get the King of France's approval for their impending marriage. And
why did they need that?
Well, they didn't actually need it officially. This was PR, basically. If one of the most powerful leaders in the world gives his approval, and all he has to do is really just to allow them into his court, and then that's a sign that he approves of Anne Boleyn. Then that speaks volumes, because Anne Boleyn is seen as this, well, she's called the concubine, the great whore by the rest of Europe. And so if the King of France agrees to receive her at his court, then suddenly her status goes up several notches and it's taken as approval for the marriage. So that's why Henry and Anne do this. And of course, Anne has an association with France, having spent several years there in her youth. So certainly, whether or not they're betrothed before or just before that voyage, or indeed when they land back in Dover, they're sleeping together pretty quickly because Anne is already pregnant by the time they marry in January 1533. Hence the need for a rush, because actually Henry's annulment hasn't come through yet, and it doesn't come through until May 1533. We tend to overlook that fact that he's a bit of a bigamist for a while, and then the annulment comes through in May, and Anne is crowned in June, and very, very visibly pregnant by then.
When is Elizabeth born?
7th of September. So in August 1533, Anne and Henry sailed to Greenwich. That's the palace appointed for the birth. Henry himself was born there. Sadly, it's one of those lost Tudor palaces. And everything looked like it was going according to plan. And Anne started her labour on the 7th, and it progressed fairly quickly and fairly well. And it resulted in a healthy child who would be the glory of the Tudor dynasty. But that child, of course, was a girl. So not quite the plan that Henry had envisaged. Now, it's easy, isn't it, with hindsight, to say that that's basically the beginning of the end. Well, it wasn't, because Anne had proved that she could have a healthy child. But it was certainly a major setback. And it was a huge disappointment to Henry, who tactlessly remarked, well, never mind, boys will follow, when he first went to see his newborn daughter. So, yeah, it was crushing for Henry, I think.
How did it affect Anne?
Very differently. And this was another surprising thing for me, in that no hint whatsoever of disappointment, nothing but a very, very strong maternal bond, you see. And I mean, I say in my book, and I don't want this to sound crass, but I say, Anne is not an obviously maternal woman. Here's a woman who's kind of more at home in the political arena than the royal nursery. And yet Elizabeth's birth changes all of that. And she can't give Elizabeth enough affection. She showers her with presents. She has a velvet cushion made to place next to her throne so Elizabeth can be with her at all times. And she's bereft when Elizabeth, like all royal infants, gets sent away at the age of just 3 months and is set up in her own household at Hatfield. And Anne hardly sees her then, because she's got work to do. She needs to produce another heir. And she's pregnant 3 months after Elizabeth's birth. She's definitely under pressure now.
And so, as a mom, how do you feel about that? Like, can you leave me alone for a while?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. I think it's devastating, the idea that your baby would just be sent away. I have to say, my daughter was a terrible sleeper, so I'd have probably welcomed that when she was 3 months in, just take her away for a while. And then, but I think I'd have pretty soon missed her and wanted to go get her. So yeah, it was tremendous.
You do a really interesting, a terrific job describing in your book the process of a royal birth. It is meticulous and traditional and odd. I can't think of another word for it. Yes. Please talk about what Anne would have went through as a royal woman preparing to give birth.
Yeah. So thanks to Lady Margaret Beaufort, this great matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, the mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII, she set down these ordinances or rules for a royal birth. And as you say, very detailed, very strict. So the royal wife could only be served by women, no men allowed in the birthing chamber. For a month, she had to go into seclusion, a month before the birth. Served only by women, no natural light allowed in. Fires had to be lit in every room. Remember, this is August. Even in England, it's pretty hot in August. So it must have been quite stifling. And then it all gets weird. There's things like you have to tie the skin of an ox around the thigh of the labouring woman, and then that'll ensure a healthy birth. And of course, lots of religious rituals as well. And all of this must have really just ramped up the tension, I think, in that birthing chamber. It must have been a suffocating environment. The theory is that all of this was to create a womb-like environment, the dark, the heat. But yeah, talk about just piling on the pressure for poor Anne.
One of the things that you just said a few minutes ago and came through in your book is it could be said, or it could be asserted, that Anne, given this is the 16th century, let's throw that in there, could have rejected Elizabeth, been resentful. Hey, you screwed up everything, Liz. What the hell are you doing? I needed a son. And there's absolutely no evidence of that at all.
No, not at all. And the opposite is the case. There's no sense of resentment ever. And Anne is always trying to promote her daughter's interests, make sure that she is, attended by the best people, that she is given all the honor due to her, as she is now heir to the throne, even though she's just a girl. And so, yeah, I think this speaks volumes about this very strong bond that develops from birth between mother and daughter. And even though Elizabeth has her father's flame red hair, her features are all Anne's. She looks very, very much like Anne Boleyn, from what we can tell from the surviving portraits.
And Elizabeth is the heir because Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was annulled.
Yes.
So then Mary, who was their daughter, is now no longer in the succession.
Correct. Yes, exactly. So this is the annulment, as you say, that results really in Princess Mary being illegitimate, because if her parents' marriage wasn't valid, then, yeah, she is not legitimate. She has no right to the throne. What I love is that when Elizabeth comes to the throne and people are questioning her legitimacy, she's presented with this family tree that she almost certainly commissioned. And this family tree refers to Anne Boleyn as the first wife of Henry VIII. So, Catherine of Aragon airbrushed from history. She didn't exist. She wasn't the lawful wife. Anne Boleyn was the first lawful wife of Henry VIII.
Did Elizabeth and Catherine of Aragon ever meet?
No, there's no record of that, because Catherine had been banned from court well before Elizabeth's birth. And, even Catherine's daughter, Mary, wasn't allowed to visit her. So, no. I do think, this is a subject for another podcast probably, but really interesting to look at the relationship between Elizabeth and Mary.
Yes, you took my next question.
Yeah, who should have just hated each other. And certainly it was tricky, their relationship later on. But actually, to Mary's credit, she seems to have been quite affectionate towards Elizabeth, particularly after Anne's execution. And she sort of took her under her wing a bit. She was much older than Elizabeth. And actually, there was a great deal of affection between those two sisters, even though their mothers had been sworn enemies.
Beautifully detailed in your book, that relationship. Yes. Please come back on and let's discuss
yes,
that.
Please.
I'm a big fan of Mary the First.
Good.
Maybe it's my Roman allegiances, but I think she's been a bit maligned with her nickname.
Yes.
Let's fast forward just a bit. In between the time of Elizabeth's birth and Anne's execution, what leads to Anne's falling out of favor? Is there anything other than the failure to produce a male heir that you, as a historian, would consider legitimate grounds for Anne's execution?
No legitimate grounds at all, no, I would say. But her fall is 90% due to her failure to produce a male heir. But then there is the Thomas Cromwell factor as well. Because so Thomas Cromwell being Henry VIII's chief minister, right-hand man, henchman, as he's often called. So he and Anne start out as allies, but they soon become enemies. And they fall out over the dissolution of the monasteries. And what Cromwell wants and what he gets is to divert all of the riches from the monasteries to the crown. What Anne wants is for those riches to go to charitable causes. So she's quite a social reformer. And now this might seem like, well, not a small point of difference, but, something they can talk through, but it divides them. And that proves deadly for Anne, because now not only is Henry rapidly cooling off from Anne, but his chief minister has got reason to have Anne in his sights. He wants her out of the way. And she's told Cromwell, I want to see your head off your shoulders. So it becomes a battle to the death between these awful figures at the Tudor court. And Cromwell is never one to back the wrong horse. He knows that Anne is losing Henry's favour, so he gives Henry a way out. I think he does devise the whole adultery case, but there are no legitimate grounds to bring Anne to court at all. She might have been a flirt. She had a lot of male attention. Didn't go further than that.
But she was a unabashed flirt.
Yeah. And she was perhaps a little unguarded in some of the things that she said, particularly to Henry Norris, where this is what really helped condemn her when, she sort of asked him why he wasn't married yet and, basically hinting, are you really in love with me? And you look to dead men's shoes. In other words, you're waiting till the king dies and then you can marry me. Now, if she said that was pretty foolish, because even talking of the king's death, it was treason. And now Cromwell twists this into a plot between Norris and Anne to murder the king. And it's all just gossip and hearsay. But yeah, it's kind of enough.
How shocked was Anne as the process started for her downfall and trial?
Deeply shocked. Like, she knew something was happening a few days before her arrest in May 1536, but she hadn't got a clue what was coming. And, she demanded to know the charges, and there was this lack of information that they still were preparing the case against her when she was arrested. And she was deeply shocked, and her composure did kind of crumble when she reached the Tower, and she became almost hysterical, as you would. But then that famed courage of hers comes through, and she's remarkable in the way she defends herself, tries to find out what's going on. And she's pretty unshakable in the face of this horror that is unfolding all around her.
Did she ever think she could survive it, either in terms of her life or things going back to status quo ante?
Yeah, I think she did. I think Anne wasn't alone in believing that Henry VIII wasn't going to go through with this, that it was just he was just teaching her a lesson, because there's a sense of people being unprepared at the Tower. Even the constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, nobody's thought about a coffin for Anne. That when she's beheaded, they have to kind of go into the armory and get an old arrow chest and bury Anne in that. And, there are all these mishaps on the day of Anne's execution that suggest that, people think, yeah, he's not going to go through with it. And Anne, when she's making her way to the scaffold, apparently is forever looking around her. Where's the messenger with this royal pardon? Henry's leaving it late, but he's not going to do this. And then really it's only, I think, moments before that she realizes this is real now.
And what about the last sweet act of kindness of Henry VIII when it came to Anne's execution. He
How
was
touching.
he is so touching. Go ahead.
I know. What a guy. What a guy Henry VIII was, as a very touching kind of parting gesture. He orders a swordsman from Calais because the axe is, more often used for executions, but it's a bit unreliable. It can take 2 or 3 blows, if not more, to sever a head. Sword, much swifter. Therefore, much kinder. In Henry's eyes, he was doing Anne a real service here. So he went to a great deal of trouble. But what we know is because this guy comes from Calais, Henry ordered him before Anne had even stood trial. So talk about a foregone conclusion.
Did Catherine Howard get the axe?
She got the axe. Yeah, he didn't go to that Catherine Howard.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is Dr. Tracy Borman, author of Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who forever changed British history. Those of us who have been to the Tower of London and we see the glass pillow that's supposed to represent Anne's place of execution. Isn't that correct? Even though they're not really sure where it took place.
Yeah, that's right.
Where is Anne buried?
Yeah, so Anne is buried in the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower, along with Cromwell, by the way. He joined her there 4 years later. Thomas More was laid to rest there. It's like the who's who of Tudor England. All of those kind of convicted traitors were laid to rest there in that actually quite beautiful chapel. It's where I got married.
It is beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It's stunning. And we do know actually that the spot of Anne's execution, we haven't got it right, where we tell visitors that, as you say, there's that glass monument. It actually wasn't there. It was right next to the White Tower. So that famous kind of central keep in the Tower of London, just outside the jewel house where the crown jewels are kept. That's where Anne was executed.
So her daughter, Elizabeth, is 3 years old when Anne is executed. What about her relationship with Henry VIII as she starts to grow up? Henry marries Jane Seymour next. They have a son who becomes Edward the Sixth.
Yes, correct.
And Jane Seymour dies shortly after childbirth. He then marries Anne of Cleves, which doesn't last very long. And is that what brings down Cromwell, is the Anne of Cleves?
It doesn't help. It's not the only factor, but it certainly doesn't help.
Then he marries Catherine Howard, who's a bit of she's a friendly lady.
That's one way of putting it.
And she is executed.
Yeah.
Then he marries Catherine Parr, who survives him.
Yeah, correct.
How is Elizabeth treated during this time? And how does Elizabeth interact with her father, Henry VIII?
So Elizabeth is pretty much an outcast after Anne Boleyn's execution. Henry forgets all about her, or tries to. She's sent away to a succession of kind of houses in the country, and Henry doesn't like any reminder of her, particularly because she looks so much like Anne Boleyn. It's thanks to Catherine Parr, the last of Elizabeth's many stepmothers, that she is eventually kind of welcomed back to court and restored to the order of succession, even though she has been declared illegitimate because Henry and Anne's marriage had also been annulled. She is actually restored to the line of succession. And that's all thanks to Catherine Parr. Otherwise, she shares some of her education with her baby brother, Edward. And she also, as I said, spends time with Mary. And so things are settled for Elizabeth. They become a bit more settled, a bit less turbulent, but still she's keenly aware that her status has taken a bit of a blow. The contrast when Anne Boleyn was alive, she was always ordering these beautiful clothes for Elizabeth. And then just a few months after Anne's execution, one of Elizabeth's household is having to write to Cromwell saying, look, Elizabeth's outgrown all her clothes. She needs clothes. You need to send some supplies because she's been forgotten about by Henry. And I think if it hadn't been for Catherine Parr, she'd have been forgotten about permanently. Elizabeth in public, she's got nothing but good to say about Henry, even though he's done this to her mother. But she's a political animal. She knows what she's doing. And you can't discredit the king, your father. And also, Elizabeth likes to remind people, I am Henry VIII's daughter. I have a right to the throne. So, of course, she's going to speak positively about him. But when you look at her actions, not her words, they're all about Anne Boleyn. They're all about trying to rehabilitate her mother's reputation.
Is it true that, forgive me if I don't remember this correctly from the book, but Elizabeth and Henry would go years without seeing each other, or just months?
Oh, no, it could be almost a year. There's only sort of, I guess a relatively brief time, but there's sort of, so Anne's executed 1536, Henry dies 11 years after that. I think years is probably accurate. It's never entirely clear exactly where Elizabeth is when, but we tend to hear about it when she sees Henry. And we're talking just a handful of references to that. So yeah, it probably is years.
Henry dies in 1547. How long had it been? Was Elizabeth present when he died? And if not, how long had they not seen each other before Henry's death?
So Elizabeth wasn't present, and neither was Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, or any of the children. In fact, he had a very, very private death. So we know Elizabeth was at court 3 years before that, or 2.5 years before that, when Catherine Parr was regent for Henry, when he went on this kind of last gasp campaign for military glory in France, and he left Catherine to run the show, and she invited Elizabeth to come with her and hold court with her. But then the records dry up a bit in terms of when else Elizabeth might have seen her father. It's possible that they were both briefly at the Christmas celebrations in 1546. But Henry didn't stick around for very long at those because he was clearly very, very sick. So he kind of retreated to Whitehall Palace almost on his own, just 3 people to attend him.
And besides perhaps her intrinsic benevolence, is it fair to say Catherine Parr could be generous to the 3 children?
Yeah.
Not because she was under no pressure to produce an heir.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, there were faint hopes of an heir, but I think everybody knew that wasn't going to happen. She could be, she had the luxury of being able to be benevolent, but I think she deserves a lot of credit for how she treats all of her stepchildren. And she's very fair. She doesn't kind of favor one over the other, because the political thing to do would have been to give all the attention to Edward, future king. But she pays at least as much attention to Henry's daughters. And yeah, she tries to kind of be a force for unity in the royal family. And that's much needed, I think.
And Edward and Elizabeth were Protestant.
Yes.
And Mary was Catholic. And so that could have certainly have been a way for Queen Catherine Parr to separate the family out a little bit.
Yeah.
Henry dies in 1547. Edward VI dies in 1553.
Correct, yeah.
Then Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, dies in 1558.
Yeah, and you've got Lady Jane Grey briefly in between those two. But
did you hear that, Dr. Tallis? Did you hear that? Yes, Lady Jane Grey. She should be on the roll of British monarchs. Anyway.
Yeah, Nicholas told me off about that before, so I always make sure to say.
So how was Elizabeth treated during those reigns, those 2 brief reigns, Edward VI and Mary Tudor? Because as you mentioned a few minutes ago, they had a great relationship, Mary and Elizabeth. Then it got a little sideways, a little tricky there when Mary became queen.
Yeah, it certainly got tricky. Elizabeth had a fairly reasonable time of it under Edward. There was the whole Thomas Seymour scandal when it was rumoured she'd had an affair with Catherine Parr's new husband, Thomas Seymour. But apart from that, she and Edward got along very well. Not so Elizabeth and Mary. They had been affectionate, as I mentioned, but now Mary was queen. That religious divide really drove the sisters apart. And Mary saw Elizabeth as a threat, because she probably was, actually, not deliberately, but she became this figurehead for all of those who were opposed to Mary. And so kind of the Protestant half of the country, if you like, who didn't want Mary to return us to the Roman Catholic fold. So that's when things got quite hairy for Elizabeth. And she ended up in the Tower of London on suspicion of plotting against her sister. And she was kept in Anne Boleyn's apartments for good measure and, eventually released. But they waited until the 19th of May, 1554, to release her. Just a bit of psychological torture there, I think. They waited until the anniversary of her mother's execution.
How did Elizabeth become Queen of England on the death of Queen Mary?
Well, I think Mary would have avoided it if she could, but she had no children. And she'd seen firsthand what happens if you try to alter the succession away from the next legitimate heir, because that had happened with Lady Jane Grey, didn't end well for poor Jane. So Mary, pretty much on her deathbed, named Elizabeth her heir, but kind of begged her to uphold the Catholic faith. And I think Elizabeth said, yeah, of course, I'll do that. And then had no intention of doing that at all. So yeah, she became queen in November 1558. Finally, after all the twists and turns of fortune, Elizabeth was finally on the throne.
We have a few more minutes on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Dr. Tracy Borman, author of Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who forever changed British history. But Elizabeth, this is in the podcast I did with Kate and Owen from Hever Castle, which I went to go see several months ago, and it's absolutely beautiful. I did not wear my divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived t-shirt for this interview as much as I wanted to. So Elizabeth remains unmarried, a virgin with a capital V. Yeah. We talked at the beginning of the podcast about this need to produce an heir, specifically a male heir. Did Elizabeth not feel that same pressure?
She did, but I think she had learned from her predecessors' example. Who do I marry? If I marry somebody from overseas, like Mary did, that will spark rebellion. If I marry a homegrown candidate, that could spark civil war. But I think there was more to it than that for Elizabeth. As she famously said, I will have but one mistress here and no master. She was very much her mother's daughter. She didn't want a man bossing her around. She'd waited this long for the crown and she was going to enjoy it. But of course, that did condemn her father's dynasty to extinction. And there is a theory that she did that deliberately to avenge her mother's death. Interesting theory. I'm not sure she would have gone that far. I think she was too pragmatic for that. But it did have the effect of serving sweet revenge for Anne Boleyn.
But James I, who becomes King of England in 1603, he's Henry VIII's nephew.
Yeah.
So he could have become a Tudor king he was the grandson of Henry VII. I mean, if he had chosen to, but
yes. Yeah, exactly. So it was you're right. It was the beginning of the Stuarts, the end of the Tudors, but there was still a fair bit of Tudor blood in there. Henry VIII, it was slightly uncertain whether James would take the throne, because Henry VIII had actually made a will barring his Scottish relatives from the English throne. He hated Scotland. He was a great rival with the King of Scots. But really, James was Elizabeth's closest blood relative, so she didn't really have that much of a choice.
And he was Protestant.
Yeah, exactly. Right religion. Bit of Tudor blood. Yeah, that'll do.
How did Elizabeth honor her mother as has her reign progressed. She reigned for 45 years. So you can understand at the beginning of the reign, I mean, Anne hadn't been dead for too long. I mean, 20 years when Elizabeth comes. But now when you get into the 1570s and 80s and 90s, did she maintain that, daughter devotion?
Yes, she absolutely did. It ramped up as the reign went on. One of the earliest things she did as queen was to appoint Boleyns. She filled her court with Boleyns, both her male advisors and the women who served her in private. Basically, it was pretty much impossible to get a job at Elizabeth's court unless you had some kind of, relationship to Anne Boleyn, whether it was a blood relationship or a friendship, whatever it may be. But then Elizabeth becomes less and less discreet about her mother as her reign goes on. At first, she's very much the political pragmatist. She's not going to make a song and dance about it because she knows half her kingdom see her as illegitimate. So she can't make a big fanfare about Anne Boleyn. But she does more as the reign progresses, surrounding herself with Anne's emblems, the white falcon in particular. Her courtiers soon realise this is a good way to win favour with Elizabeth. So they start displaying Anne Boleyn's emblems and her portraits. This is when pretty much all of Anne Boleyn's portraits date from, is Elizabeth's reign. She writes about her mother. She mentions her mother, adopts her mother's motto, Semper Eadem, or always the same. And right to the end, really, her funeral procession is bedecked with her mother's emblems, and even her tomb in Westminster Abbey, there's a falcon on that as well. So, Elizabeth.
Are there reports of Elizabeth visiting Anne's tomb or trying to make it more ostentatious?
No, there aren't, and people thought that she would have her mother reburied. In the same way that James I later would with Mary, Queen of Scots, interring her in Westminster Abbey. But I think Elizabeth was very conscious that she'd be literally lost if she did that at the beginning of her reign, because, as I say, drawing attention to the fact she's Anne's daughter and Anne is so controversial. So she chose not to do that, but she definitely honoured her in more practical ways. And as I say, I think probably the strongest indicator is that, all of the Boleyn relatives she appointed. But I can't not mention the Chequers ring, because this is such a poignant piece of evidence for Elizabeth's feelings towards Anne. This ring that's named after the British Prime Minister's country residence, Chequers House. And it's a locket ring owned by Elizabeth from the 1570s that opens to reveal the portraits of two women. One is Elizabeth, and the other is almost certainly Anne Boleyn. There's some controversy around that, but Elizabeth treasured this locket ring and kept it with her until the day she died.
Many mothers of monarchs have lived long into their son or daughter's reign. Most recently, the Queen Mother, I think, lived like 49 years or something like that into Elizabeth II's reign. Give us Anne Boleyn's thoughts on Queen Elizabeth I.
Oh, would she have been proud or what? She would have been triumphant, because Elizabeth was able to do what Anne would have done if she lived longer. She was this icon of female power. She wielded authority over a court filled with men. She changed minds about women's position in society and confounded every expectation about herself as a female monarch. People thought she would make a mess of it, as other queens had done before her. By the end of her long reign, she'd made England fall in love with queens, and later queens benefited from that. So I think Anne would have been inordinately proud of her daughter. I do think, though, somebody once asked me, what if Anne had lived and, as you say, become, a matriarch in Elizabeth's reign? How do you think they'd have got on? And I think sparks would have flown between these two women, because they're both quite fiery. So I don't think it would have always been harmonious. But I wish Anne had known the triumph that she would enjoy through her daughter Elizabeth.
May I ask one more question before we end the podcast on a completely different topic? It's been just recent that England had its first coronation in 70 years. A lot of us watched it on television and read the articles and everything about it. You were involved as someone, as an expert. What was it like as a Brit, if I may use that term, to actually, and as a historian, watch a coronation in person as opposed to, the films and the pictures of years gone by?
Robert, it was fascinating because, as you know, because we chatted about it, my book, Crowne and Scepter, 1,000 years, I wrote the full history of the monarchy. So I knew what to expect. I've written about many coronations and they all follow the same plan, the anointing and the crowning and all the words that would be said. And yet somehow it came as a total surprise as I was watching it. It's like, this really does happen, and it was just surreal to see it being played out in front of my eyes. And I could hardly even bear to blink. I thought, I am watching a sovereign being crowned live for the first time. And actually, that was the experience shared by most people around the world. 70 years is a long reign. So it was new for most of us, but extraordinary. What a moment.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Dr. Tracy Borman, author of Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who forever changed British history. If you want your opinion as a listener to this podcast to forever be changed about British history, read books from Tracy Borman. Thank you, Dr. Borman, for coming on. It's always a pleasure. You're so generous with your time. Your books are wonderful. And I have to say this, I just love talking with you.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.